right, hello everybody, and welcome to the debut episode of the Magus Brothers podcast. This is about two friends, or I guess, we've known each other so long at this point, we may as well be brothers. I am your co-host, Tyler, and with me as always is...
Hey y'all, I'm Feyerbrand, and thank you all for joining us on our very first episode in what I hope turns into a long thing of words, a very long-going podcast.
With many words. We will be tackling news in regards to anything Final Fantasy. We'll be talking theories, speculation, rumors. We're going to cover everything. This is going to be our take on Final Fantasy, our opinions, what we love, what we don't love. We want to be transparent with you about what we do and what we take away from the franchise that is Final Fantasy that's been going on for 30 years now? How long has Final Fantasy been a thing at this point?
I think over 30 years. Because now we're in 2021.
Remember that rumor where there was going to be a gift box set of every Final Fantasy in this massive thing that was going to be $1,000? Do you remember this?
I do remember that because I was saving up for it. I was planning on buying it. It was called the Crystal Collector's Edition or something like Crystal Bear Edition. I don't remember what it's called. But I do remember it, and it was going around, I think around the 30th anniversary or something like that.
Well, I don't know when that would be the best time to do it. I don't know if it's 35 years, 40 years, whatever the case is, but I hope they do that. That would be great. But anyway, down the road, we're going to be bringing on guests ranging from important content creators to voice actors and who knows what else. We ask you what humor, what information, what chemistry we bring resonates with you. Stick around. Join us on this journey guided by the light and love for all things Final Fantasy. I want to take a moment to do a special thanks. The intro and outro music for this podcast is brought to you by Chocobo Band. If you enjoyed it, please check them out on Spotify, Apple Music, their website, wherever streaming service they are available. They are fantastic, and we love them. Links to their music and information about them will be in the details and description of our podcast. I also want to do a special thanks for Kai with the Reunion Podcast, another great podcast dedicated to Final Fantasy VII Remake. Matt Diorio with Crashing Game Night for mentoring as well. Again, their podcast will also be in the description and details. And Chris with the First Encounter podcast, a hilarious podcast about Chris and Haney as Haney goes through Final Fantasy VII for the first time in his adult life. Hilarious reactions. It's probably the closest thing you can ever get to playing Final Fantasy for the very first time. Chris is editing this podcast, so special thank you to Chris for his effort.
Very much.
Again, that podcast details and description will also be around, so check that out. That all being said, Feyerbrand,
yes.
Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Hello, y'all. I'm Feyerbrand. I'm 32 years old, and I am married with 5 children. I know that's crazy.
That's a lot of kids.
I know. Who think you're going to have a whole basketball team running around your house at 32? But yet here I am because I'm crazy, and I've lost control of my life.
and you do Twitch. You stream, or not stream. What's a word? Twitching? Is that streaming? Is that what it's called?
I am pretty twitchy. But yes, I do stream on Twitch. That's twitch.tv/Feyerbrand. I play a lot of JRPGs with a heavy emphasis on Final Fantasy, almost mostly Final Fantasy VII, as it's my favorite. I like to play modded versions of it as well as challenge runs. So you can check that out. I stream Friday and Saturday nights starting at 6 p.m. Mountain Time.
The real question, though, is how do you find time to do that with 5 children running around?
It's having an awesome wife who supports me in the things that I want to do, and it's a lot of give and take. I pick up for her for when she wants to have her time to do her things, and then she picks up the slack when I want to be able to do my things.
No joke. Wives are the real MVPs. We got wonderful wives.
That's the truth, brother.
All right. So tell me about your history of Final Fantasy, how you got into it, how you discovered it. Give me a little bit there.
Okay. My introduction to Final Fantasy was with Final Fantasy VII, right around the time it came out, 97, 98 time frame. I had a PlayStation 1, and my cousin convinced my grandmother to buy me Final Fantasy VII. I remember her handing it to me, and it was the first time I'd ever seen a multi-disc game. So I was already a little confused by the thick game case. And I remember opening the game case up and thinking, this looks really stupid. I don't ever want to play this. and I shelved it. Well, my sister, she thought it looked cool, so she plugged in and played it. And I was like, all right, whatever, I'll just watch her play it then. I watched the intro cutscene, the train coming down and all of that, and I was instantly hooked. I basically kicked her off the PlayStation, and it's pretty much been Final Fantasy consuming my life ever since. Well, what about you, man? Let's hear your random information and background and introduction.
Yeah, so, taking a little break from Final Fantasy, my name is Tyler. I am 33. I don't have 5 kids. I've got my son, and he's fantastic. He's 5 and is, as I'll kind of dive into here in a little bit, he's discovering the wonderful nature of Final Fantasy. He has started out watching, actually, Feyerbrand, your no commentary playthrough on YouTube, and then watching me play the game a little bit, and it's now evolved to him being able to play the Final Fantasy VII Remake by himself on easy mode. Granted, he's using my save file and I'm like level 50 maxed out, so there's an easiness to it. But, and now, for bedtime stories, we look at Final Fantasy art books and read about character biographies and stuff like that. So, yeah, we'll talk more about that. But, as far as Final Fantasy goes, I sometimes get the timelines a little mixed up, but I had never had a PlayStation. My intro to video games was pretty much confined to like Mario on the Super Nintendo, and I had never played Zelda or heard of Final Fantasy before that. And I think I started playing Pokemon on a Game Boy, like one of the old fat Game Boys, and I loved Pokemon because of the original monster designs. They were like little kaijus running around, and I thought that was great. And then at some point, I was in Ohio visiting a cousin, and I saw him play Final Fantasy VII, and I remember him summoning Leviathan and just going, oh my god, that is so cool. That is the coolest thing I've ever seen. And then I still didn't have a PlayStation. I lived in an apartment, and someone across the way in a different apartment let me borrow their PlayStation. I still don't think I had a PlayStation, but they let me borrow it, and they let me borrow Final Fantasy 7 and 8. So I know it was like after 1999. I was probably like 12 because both games were out. And I played 7. And again, much like you, I was like, what the hell? Like, I'm used to like cartridges and having a blow on them, and here there's like 4 discs in a thing. Like, what kind of nightmare is this? And I played 7. I remember playing it with my younger brother. He's about a year and a half younger than me, and he was there the whole time. And I remember us both crying when Aerith dies. And then right after 7, I played 8, and I loved it. So, those games like changed my life. I got a PlayStation after that, and I loved it. I loved those games. And that being said, there's a lot of Final Fantasies I actually haven't played. Like, it's interesting. We're doing a Final Fantasy podcast, but there's a lot of Final Fantasies I haven't actually played. And I want to do a disclosure about that for anyone following along, because this will probably get brought up, and it might, through our journey with this podcast, I may even revisit Final Fantasies I've never touched.
Oh, I'm going to make him.
I expect you to. But I haven't played Final Fantasies 1 through 5, any of them. I am familiar with these characters a bit because I've played games like mobile games like Record Keepers, and Brave Exvius, and in Record Keepers, like, you actually go back and revisit parts of the game. So, like, I'm familiar with bosses and, like, the characters and stuff, but I couldn't necessarily tell you, like, the narrative about these things very much. But it's not like they're completely alien to me. I didn't play Final Fantasy VI until I was, like, 29 or 30. I have not played 12.
What?
I've started it up and played it a little bit, but I have not beaten it.
I didn't know that.
Or gotten far enough to actually be relevant, in my opinion.
That's blasphemous.
I know. That's like, when I go back and revisit Final Fantasies, 12 is probably going to be one of the first ones I go back to do, because...
Yes, it will. I'm going to give you a priority list.
Do it. We could post it on Twitter. And I've played 13. I started 13-2, but didn't get very far. Have not played 13-3. What is that? Lightning's Return? Is that what it's called? Lightning Returns?
Yeah, Lightning Returns.
Haven't played that one. I am actively playing 15. Like, literally, I was playing it earlier today. I never beat that game on release, and I struggled with it. But honestly, I still kind of struggle with it, but I'm powering through.
It made me cry.
Yeah, we'll touch on that, because even though you and I both love Final Fantasy, our preferences within Final Fantasy vary wildly. And even with our favorite game, both of our favorite games being Final Fantasy VII, our opinions vary wildly within that game. So it'll be fun. It'll be fun. But yeah, so what about you, Feyerbrand? What Final Fantasies have you not played?
So I have played every single mainline numbered Final Fantasy, but I have not beaten them all because, well, some of them, like Final Fantasy 2, was so awful I couldn't bring myself to get past like the 10-hour mark.
Yeah, I'm going to struggle when I go back to replay those old Final Fantasies because while I don't know that they're bad. You know, when you take a step back and go like, this is a bad game, I don't know that they're bad, but because of where I started with Final Fantasy and where I expect video games, it's just going to be so hard to go back to mechanics and visuals and graphics. And I hate to be like pretentious, but it's like it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be difficult to go back to that.
So you got to remember, though, Final Fantasy 3 and 4 both had 3D remakes.
I forget that.
They're available on Steam as well as like the 3DS or something. So those ones aren't as bad. 1 and 2 had PSP remakes, and 1's actually pretty easy to play through. It's just 2's awful like leveling system is really what did that one in for me. But
I forgot to mention, I got to throw it in there. I have not played the tactics. We've talked about this, but I forgot about them. I got to touch on that. Didn't touch those.
That's also blasphemy.
I know.
That's my favorite one outside of mainline games.
And like so many of these games are on Steam, and you tell me all the time, but I hate playing at a computer, and I'm just like, please just release them to the PlayStation 5 and or 4.
I agree as well. Even though I own them all on my computer, I also want them on PlayStation. So let's see. I've even played both MMOs.
Same.
What have I not played? I guess a lot of the weird spin-offs like Mystic Quest and like Crystal Chronicles or any of the Chocobo games. I don't know if we want to count those. I mean, they're Final Fantasy games, but they're not mainstream.
We're really addressing the mainline titles in this. You know, direct sequels like Dirge or Crisis Core or 13.2 or 13.3. Like, we'll address those too. But like Crystal Chronicles, probably not going to address. World of Final Fantasy, probably not going to address.
Oh, I've played that.
I want to play it. I feel like my son would get down on it. But like...
He would. It's Pokemon Final Fantasy. It's actually an incredible game.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, just get past the chibi stuff. It's an incredible game with a good story.
Okay.
And solid mechanics.
But primarily, we're going to focus on the main titles. And spoiler alert, I consider 11 and 14 main titles. I don't care if they're MMOs.
They are.
They're great.
They are. They have stories, even if 11's was kind of weird. But
you know
14's story, on the other hand, made up for its weirdness in 11 because 14, oh my God.
Speaking of weird Final Fantasy games, did you ever play that 3DS game? I forget what it's called, but it was basically Final Fantasy as Monster Hunter.
I've never played Final Fantasy. I forget what it's called.
Okay, well...
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I played that a lot. Like, I played it a fair amount.
Final Fantasy Monster Hunter?
You fight the summons, and they drop things, and you make armor out of them and stuff like that. Like, it's literally just like a Monster Hunter ripoff.
What?
Yeah.
Okay, now I feel like I've been cheated out of a really good experience, and I don't know how this totally flew past my radar.
It is nowhere near as in-depth as Monster Hunter, and they did not follow it up with anything, but you do some magic. It's not as cool as Monster Hunter. It lacks a lot of the depth and nuance, but it's basically Monster Hunter, and you fight summons, and you make weapons and armor out of them. And they have the rare drops and all of that and everything for the 3DS.
Well, at least I know what I'm looking into after this.
I played that with my wife. We play that a lot. Anyway, so kind of going back to... Well, actually, was there more Final Fantasies you didn't touch?
No, I played every single numbered Final Fantasy and their sequels, as well as Tactics and its sequels.
So that being said, kind of circling back to this whole idea of you and I have very different opinions within Final Fantasy and even within our favorite games. What is most important to you in a Final Fantasy? Like, we're talking mechanics, battle system, aesthetic, narrative, characters, all of these things. Like, what do you look for? What matters most at the end of the day? What's going to sell you on a Final Fantasy?
So the thing with Final Fantasy is I tend to give it a pretty, I tend to go easy on them. Because
we love Final Fantasy enough to make podcasts and stream it. And
exactly.
Twitch.
Like, I'm just a fanboy. I tend to not be super critical of the game really at all. Like, I've played and enjoyed most of them. But like the things that really like get me going is like some good mechanics. And it doesn't even have to be battle mechanics. It can be like, I need to go and do this 10-minute long menu because I need to optimize all of my characters, or, you know, if there's some sort of crafting thing or something, whatever, you know, changing jobs, all that kind of stuff. Just sort of that min-max.
What's one of your favorite mechanics?
Oh, I have no idea.
Okay. Like if you...
Oh, jobs. I know what it is. I like to change jobs.
Okay.
Which is why I liked 10-2's ATB combat. That's the pinnacle of ATB combat. Come at me. I liked how you had the different sphere grids that you allocated your job spheres in, and then as you changed your job throughout battle, you could activate buffs for your characters. And then that on top of like the incredible ATB combat already, it was just like the cherry on top.
Yeah, Final Fantasy X's battle system is so great. I need to revisit it really badly. But what else aside from mechanics? What's some of the big selling points for you?
I don't know, man. I guess it'd have to be like setting and aesthetic. I'm really into like the steampunk world of 7, obviously. The super high fantasy stuff from like 9 doesn't really do it for me as an adult, because I guess now I feel like it's so overdone and so many games have it and I'm tired of seeing it. I want to see something different, which scares me about 16, but also it's being done by a really great team, which we'll get into later. But the thing about Final Fantasy is that ever since like 10, the mainline titles have changed so drastically with mechanics, aesthetic, characters, tropes, all of that stuff, that I don't shy away from a game anymore, a Final Fantasy game anymore, because I'm like, oh, this has this and I normally don't like it. I still try to embrace it because I know they're going to put that Final Fantasy Square Enix spin on it and do something new and most likely divide the entire fan base, but it's going to be new and different. I don't have one or two specific things I look for. I guess it's just more of the whole experience overall. How does that game make me feel when I finish it?
That's fair.
Like Final Fantasy 15 made me cry.
Nothing wrong with that. I, in playing Final Fantasy 15, which we'll talk about, I'm sure there'll be episodes dedicated to the things we struggle with each individual Final Fantasy, but I am still, to a degree, struggling with Final Fantasy 15. And in playing it earlier today, I was evaluating some of the issues I have with Final Fantasies personally and why I struggle with certain ones versus others. And as much as I would love to sit here and like give these really in-depth answers about mechanics, battle systems, narratives, and stuff like that, the first thing that really, really does it for me with a Final Fantasy, or doesn't do it, is the aesthetic. And circling back to like the high fantasy aspect, there's degrees of high fantasy, right? Because we have games like Final Fantasy VII, which has really heavy steampunk and cyberpunk elements to it, but you also have characters that, like Nanaki, who is not human, is a great character. And I love when characters are not human. I love to see some diversity. But the style and how it was represented in 7 was great. When we get to a title like 9 is high fantasy. 12 is high fantasy to a degree. And they have a lot of races in 12 that are not human. And then even in 14 is high fantasy. And granted, 14 spans, they've got some tech all over the place and they have like Magitech and a lot of stuff, but that's still high fantasy. And they have a lot of non-human races there. And I love 14. And 12, I have nothing against the aesthetic in 12. But 9, it's hard to pin down where I struggle with 9, but 9 I struggle with because of the aesthetic, the way the characters are presented in that kind of like, I wouldn't call it chibi style, but there's a certain art style with it that I struggle with, and it just gives me that disconnect. And it really comes down to that. It's like aesthetic is like the first thing I go for, and I struggle real hard with it when it's not there.
Plus, Final Fantasy 9 isn't good.
Final Fantasy 9, there's a lot of people who love it. There are more people who love Final Fantasy 9 than I thought.
Oh, yeah.
I'll put it like that.
There's a lot.
And Final Fantasy 9, to me, isn't a bad game. It is a game that at the time was absolutely worth the money you paid for it. It is a long, in-depth game. It just doesn't resonate with me outside of very specific key moments of that game. Like the story is all right, and I don't like the aesthetic, but that is a game of moments. There are so many cool moments in that game where I'm just like, whoever in that boardroom or art room or planning stage was just like, Bahamut and Alexander should fight. I just want to go up and hug that person. Like, whoever that was. I just want to be like, that was great. Thank you. Because I can already tell you, if it weren't for that moment, we wouldn't have this moment coming in 16 with Ifrit fighting Phoenix. And that's going to be fantastic too. Like, summons fighting summons are so cool.
I know, that's what you live for.
We'll get to the summons, but that's what I live for. So yeah, like, aesthetic is very important. And then characters, their story, narrative, story. You know, I can pretty easily overlook battle systems in certain things. Like, there's a lot of people who don't like 8's battle system because of how different it was. And there's a lot of people who love it because of the just absolute bonkers level of customization and min-maxing you can do with it. And I'm fine with it all. I'm pretty forgiving about everything else. Much like you, like, I live for Final Fantasy, so I'll overlook a lot. And not even overlook, but I lean heavy into I'm going to put this in a positive spin as opposed to a negative spin. Like, I love this franchise. But, you know, there are some games I just don't love as much within, and that's okay too. Final Fantasy, like you said, since 7 has really changed it up. Like, every Final Fantasy is presented so wildly different, and some things just don't land personally the same way, and that's okay. They can't please everybody, and that's cool. But, you know, segueing away from that, Feyerbrand, what does Final Fantasy mean to you? I know it's like a super vague, open-ended question, but what does it mean to you?
Oh, that's actually a tough question to answer because, like, it's sort of just been my entire gaming life since I was like 9 or 10 years old or something like that. You know, I can't remember a point in my life where I haven't been actively engaged in something dealing with Final Fantasy since then. You know, the last 20 years or however long. My gaming life, my hobby life has revolved around what's the next Final Fantasy? Do I have the system to play it? And when does it come out? So I guess it's like, it's been my hobby for most of my life.
That's fair. I mirror that pretty heavily. You know, when I really got into gaming and I was like, okay, I'm a gamer. And granted, I didn't think of that at the time, but like in hindsight, it was Pokemon and Final Fantasy that was like, okay, this is me becoming a gamer. And, you know, I've played Final Fantasies throughout periods of my life, you know, 7, 8, 9, 10, 10-2. I played those games pretty much on release. You know, it was always waiting for that next Final Fantasy release. I remember I actually lived on your couch at the time when Final Fantasy 12 released. And even though I wasn't playing it, I went with you to the midnight release, I think it was. Or was it like a super early?
It wasn't even midnight. It was like 10 a.m. when the gaming like EB Games opened at 10 a.m. and we were standing in the mall like a bunch of weirdos waiting for it to open.
You know what? I'm sure I think we stayed up all night waiting for it. So maybe that's why it felt like a midnight release.
We did stay up all night. I remember that.
Honestly, like as an adult now, within the last 2 years, which is where we're going to kind of cycle back to, you know, we played a lot of Final Fantasy and we talked about it, but Final Fantasy just wasn't the same. You know, like maybe we just had too much going on and we were teenagers and, you know, trying to find places to live after moving out and dealing with the whole like, oh crap, now I suddenly have to be an adult and I wasn't ready for this, or being a teenager when you just have high school and so many other things going on. I just didn't track or follow Final Fantasy the same way. And I played other games and I was also playing music and it just wasn't as big a priority. But really in the last 2 years, that's changed pretty heavily. And a big part of that is the 7 remake. You know, I played 14 a lot, and I don't play 14 really the same way anymore because I just don't have the time and the energy and the bandwidth to do that gear ladder constantly, you know, and keep up with the patches. But when a new expansion comes out, I play, I get caught up, I get the gear, and then I'm like, okay, cool, that was fun. Shadowbringers, the story to Shadowbringers is one of the best Final Fantasy stories, period, ever.
Easily.
But 15, I got it on release, but like we've talked about, 15 just didn't, I couldn't get into 15 the same way I got into other Final Fantasies. And before that, aside from 14, the Final Fantasy I played with, aside from like revisiting an old one, was 13. And what was that, 2000?
It was announced in 2006, and I believe it came out in 2009 or 10.
And I played that on release, and then that was it. Like, I just wasn't as into Final Fantasy. But then they announced Remake And then we didn't hear anything about it, was still playing 14, and then there was that big radio silence, as we've come to expect with Square Enix, as they announce things way too early. And then I finally, what was it, State of Play a couple years back when they like revisited it finally with like an updated trailer. And I remember you and I and another friend of ours just lost our goddamn minds, and we were following every little dribbling of news. We were on Reddit, F5ing multiple times a day. We were talking about it. And then shortly thereafter, you started, not this idea, but like, I think you've always kind of been interested in it. But then Remake was coming and you were like, you know what? I'm going to start a Twitch channel. I'm going to pursue it. And then there was this hype about you doing a Twitch channel and then helping spread the word with that, talking about what you were going to do, talking about the Final Fantasy VII Remake like every single day. And then we had the demo, it released, and then, the pandemic hit and we were quarantined and inside, and then playing the remake. And then it was, of course, talking about the game, the ending. And yeah, it's just been like
the ending,
the ending, a lot of talking about the ending, which we will also get to. And then, shortly after that same year it released in September when they announced I forget what the event was called, but they announced the price point of the PlayStation 5 finally. We got hit with a trailer for Final Fantasy 16. They started that event. Those mad, those absolute insane
completely
people
left field.
Started that event with Final Fantasy 16 reveal, and it was one of the most brutal, hands down, the most brutal Final Fantasy trailer ever. Like, we straight up saw blood. A lot of blood, and it was like, holy crap. And then we find out that it's the same team that's done 14. It's got Yoshi P involved in all of this, and they're going back to that high fantasy setting, which again, kind of touching back to that high fantasy. The high fantasy that's going to be 16 presents entirely differently than the high fantasy of like 9. So it's going to be high fantasy, but it looks like it's going to be different, and there's so many questions about that, but that game looks amazing. You've got summons fighting. You've got Shiva fighting Titan, Ifrit fighting Phoenix, which, you got me. You got me by the tips of my beard there. It doesn't matter at that point. I'm sold. The logo was 2 summons fighting. Like, come on.
Yeah, they're really going pretty hard with 16, and I am here for it.
And that game had been we're over here thinking like, okay, they're doing the 7 remake. That's going to be their focus for a while. It's like, nope. That same year, they hit you with this trailer. It's like, psych, we've had a team working on this for a while.
I know. I wasn't expecting it at all, especially with, I don't remember the name of the team. It's one of the teams that does 14.
Creative Business Unit 3.
Yeah, the Creative Business Unit. And, the director of 16 was one of the big guys that did Heaven's Ward, which is my personal favorite expansion for 14. So I'm really excited to see where he takes this game.
You know why Heaven's Ward was such a great expansion?
Dragoons.
I was going to say dragons, but we're one letter away from being on the same page there.
That's kind of the closest we ever get to kind of being on the same page.
Right? It's like, our favorite game is Final Fantasy VII, but...
Yeah, but we all like the different things. These last 2 years have been actually pretty crazy to be a Final Fantasy fan. And like you said, man, like, it's what led me to actually become a streamer. And honestly, my decision to become a streamer was that I was so excited about the remake. I did not know how to express those feelings in a healthy way. Or in any way, really. Like, I just wanted to go up on a mountain and scream my head off. And I didn't know how to release how excited and happy I was that this was actually happening. And I felt the best way to do that, my best outlet, creative outlet, since I can't draw or sing or do any of that other stuff, was to share my love of Final Fantasy, specifically 7, with anybody and everybody who wanted it. And that was like the big driving point behind my channel, and to a lesser extent also so that you could watch me, since we now live in different states. we can't sit on each other's couches and watch each other play it like we used to as kids.
So true.
So, I still wear my red Avalanche headband when I stream, even if I'm not playing Final Fantasy games.
Oh man, I still have my headband on my bookcase in my room.
You should wear it more. And I had never really been involved in social media really at all. And the announcement of the 7 remake caused me to get into streaming, which, okay, now I'm going to go start getting into all these Final Fantasy JRPG Discord channels. Okay, now I'm going to make a Twitter account. All right, now I have an Instagram account. All right, now I have this account, that account. Now I'm talking to all these other people, and I'm doing all these things with people that feel the same way I do. And now it's kind of turned into this podcast where my best friend and I get together and talk about Final Fantasy, which is pretty much the coolest thing we can do.
We're essentially just taking our text messages throughout every single day and our phone calls periodically and going, okay, we're just going to talk about this on a podcast now.
Yeah, we've had some pretty in-depth text messages and phone calls, and we're like, why are we not sharing this with people? Well, here you go, people. We are now sharing it with you.
Yeah, and if you don't like our opinions or our speculations,
I don't care.
Yeah, just, turn it off. Turn off the podcast.
But don't turn it off. Listen to us.
Yeah,
seriously.
Please listen to us.
I crave attention.
Now, obviously, we best friends. We've mentioned that a couple of times. But we go way back. I think at this point, we've been in each other's lives longer than we haven't,
Yeah, I want to say sophomore year of high school. We've been friends like 16, 17 years, something like that.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's about 16 years off. But it was actually not Final Fantasy that brought us together. It was another game that we've already mentioned.
This is a great story. Here, I'll take this one.
Okay.
I'll give it to you guys from my point of view. All right. I don't even remember how I dressed sophomore year. I think I was kind of preppy-ish. I don't remember. I went through a lot of phases. Anyways, I'm walking through the quad of our high school, okay?
Because our high school was new and fancy and had a quad and was kind of like a college campus set up with like multiple buildings and stuff. Super weird. I'd never seen anything like that at the time, but continue.
This high school was like a year old. So I'm walking through the quad, and as I'm reaching the far end of it, I overhear this conversation, and I hear somebody mention Rathalos. And I stopped dead in my tracks. I'm like, there is literally nothing else they could be talking about except for Monster Hunter. I'm like, it's not possible. Literally the only thing that has Rathalos is Monster Hunter. So I stop and I turn around. I'm like, excuse me, are you guys talking about Monster Hunter? And they're like, yeah, do you play? And that's how we first ever actually introduced ourselves to each other. And then we ended up having a class like geometry or something together, and we ended up sitting next to each other, and we drew and passed Monster Hunter comics back and forth most of class.
Oh my god, I remember drawing that one with like Plesioth doing a hip check, and then it like smash cuts to somebody on the moon, and they like look up and they just go flying because Plesioth's hitbox for that hip check was ridiculous.
Yeah, this was the PS2 Monster Hunter, the original, and you used to call Rathian like Frenchie or something. I don't remember.
Yeah, because the graphics were so bad that it looked like the female Rathian had a bunch of hair. Like I didn't even realize it was spikes. I thought it was hair. It wasn't until graphics got better. And of course I was a teenager and insensitive. And so I was like female, dragon, hair, French. And of course that's completely inaccurate. But again, I was a very young teenager, so please pardon my insensitivity. But it was nicknamed Frenchie.
We were a product of our time back then, and we have since learned to not be that way. But as I know, I'm going to let you tell this half. That was not the first time we had actually ever met. We had met before unknowingly.
Yes.
And you can tell that part.
So before we had actually physically introduced ourselves, we had actually been playing Monster Hunter with each other. Because, as you know, in minigames, you get to name your character. And I was in high school, and I was reading about philosophy, and I thought I was super cool. And so I thought it would be funny to make a character that hunted monsters and made weapons and armor out of their dead carcass, and name that character Gandhi, because I just thought that was hilarious.
It gets me every time. It is funny. It is funny.
So my character was named Gandhi, and Feyerbrand had named his character because at the time he was in, I believe you call it your emo phase.
Oh yeah, that's right. I was in my emo phase at that time.
You named your character Alk 3 or Alk Trio, whatever it was, but it was
Alk 3.
It was Alk 3 based off of the Alkaline Trio. And so a friend of mine, I played with him a lot, and I think his character name was Deus. And we ran around and ended up grouping with Alk 3, and he was competent and good, which was difficult to find back in the day because, one, not many people were playing Monster Hunter on PS2. Monster Hunter was not the massive franchise as it is nowadays. So it was a very niche thing, and the quality of player...
And you had to have your PS2 online.
Yeah, exactly. And the quality of player you would end up with was but Alk 3 was great. And so we would actually like sit there and type and do the, like, what was it, like small little boxes. You had to figure out how to creatively cram your message into like a small little box.
Yeah, it was like 20 characters or something.
So we would sit there and do like the multiple messages, and then it would be like, oh, are you going to be on tomorrow? And he'd be like, yeah. And so we would like plan a time. So we were grouping together and like the three of us running around periodically. And lo and behold, then we meet in person and then we're like exchanging details. I'm like, oh, what's your character name? And he's like, Alk 3. And I was like, get the out. Like, I'm Gandhi.
Dude, completely mind-blowing. Like, you think the world is small, but when you include the internet, the world seems a lot bigger. And then you end up inadvertently meeting. It is wild.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it.
It was great. I loved it. But that's how we met. And, aside from that, as we do this podcast, I'm sure there will be many more hilarious stories that crop up with our history that you will get to hear about. So that all being said, I want to take a brief moment. It's actually really funny because in this last week, I've seen a couple of these on Twitter that we've responded to where it was like, it's got the male protagonist. I forget what his name is from Twisted. And it's got the swords all to his neck. And it's like, name that controversial opinion about this thing that gets you this reaction. And there's a bunch of people like attacking him. So kind of in spirit of that, within Final Fantasy, Feyerbrand, what controversial opinion do you have that everyone else is like, what the hell?
So I have quite a few. I won't go into too much detail, but I love Final Fantasy X-2. I love the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy, and I hate Final Fantasy 9. So yeah, come at me. Bring your pitchforks. I'm ready. What about you, man?
So I have an interesting one, and I feel like it's interesting because I feel like this is honestly the one that gets me in trouble more than any of even your opinions. And I don't like Final Fantasy VI all that much. You see those like news articles and those news sites and gaming and all of this, and they do the whole like top rated Final Fantasy. And the number one Final Fantasy is always Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VII. There was like that poll they did recently in Japan, where in Japan, actually, the number one Final Fantasy is actually Final Fantasy X, which I thought was interesting. But Final Fantasy VI just didn't resonate with me super well. Like, there was some great moments in there. There's great characters. I love Terra. She's fantastic. The whole, like, Espers and stuff like that I thought was super tight. Celeste is great. But I don't know if it's because I didn't experience the game until I was, like, 29 or 30. But, like, I just thought there were way too many. Like, the player characters, there was way too many. And
there was too many.
I didn't get why everybody loved it. And I don't know if it's...
You just didn't get it, man.
I don't know if it's me.
You don't understand,
I'm willing to replay the game and try it again. Like, I don't know. I don't know.
I feel similar. So I'm the wrong person.
But it's like, I'm always willing to try, like, Final Fantasy IX, we talked about, like, I think you and I are on a scale of 1 to 10, fall differently on our dislike of Final Fantasy IX. But I'm actually, the two Final Fantasies I'm currently playing is 15 and 9. And so I'm actively, like, revisiting 9 so I can be like, okay, is it just a different part in my life? I'm trying it. Like, is something going to resonate with me differently? Like, I actively go and revisit these titles to give them a try because I truly want to understand and I want to love the franchise. But, some titles just don't hit the same way. And 6 just didn't hit me as strongly as it seems to hit other people. I don't know.
I really don't understand that either because, it's not a bad game. Like, the game's good. I really like the mechanics with equipping the different espers and learning magic and skills and all of that stuff. And the mechanics were solid, but I feel the same way because the first time I played through it on like an emulator, and I remember not enjoying it to the point where I just put on like 300 frames per second and blitzed through the last couple of hours because I was just like, nah, all right, I'm over this. And like, Kefka was like a super lame villain.
Oh man, that's
like a clown. Like, he's just lame. Like, there was nothing menacing about him. Like, ooh, okay, yeah, cool. He destroyed the world, but why'd you let him do that? He's just a clown.
We're gonna need an episode to dive into 6 because I feel the same way. Like, everyone talks about Kefka like he's the best villain, and I'm just like, okay, but then people talk about some of the reasons why he's the best villain, and they're like, oh, well, he just actually destroys the world, and I'm like, that's not what makes a villain good. So, like,
so what, dude? He's a clown. Just go hit him in the face with a pie, dude. Just go sweep his feet out from underneath him. Like,
sweep the legs.
Dude, I don't get the Kefka love. And honestly, something even more blasphemous, I don't think his soundtrack's that good.
Yeah, that's another thing. Like, we talk about, like, what's the song? Dancing Mad. Like,
Dancing Mad. It's not that good.
Yeah, like,
it's all right. It's pretty good, but it's not like mind-blowingly, I'm sitting in awe like mouth agape as I'm just like, this is the great. No, that's One Winged Angel.
Yeah.
Definitely not Dancing Mad.
It's One Winged Angel, but more importantly, it's Liberi Fatale. Let's be serious.
That's the one you listen to in the morning as you're like getting out of bed. You're like, I'm going to kick the crap out of today. As that song plays, as you slowly walk towards the bathroom to brush your teeth and get ready. It's like that hype music, dude.
Dude, I'm 33 and I've heard that song so many times, but every time I hear Liberi Fatale, still get chills.
Hey, man, I've listened to it so many times and I still can't even say the name. So I still love it.
Oh my God. Okay, so we will revisit a lot of our controversial opinions and kind of dive into them. I want to take a minute and while we're talking freely, openly, and while we may even say like, oh, we hate this Final Fantasy. No Final Fantasy, and correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't think any Final Fantasy is a bad game. We are just talking about our personal experience with that game. Except 2. I haven't played. I'm just going to have to follow your lead there. But it's like, these are our personal experiences with the game. And I read an interesting quote, and it was on the fly, and I always want to credit people when I read something that's really interesting. But no one hates Final Fantasy the way Final Fantasy fans hate Final Fantasy. And it's kind of like that whole, like, no one hates Star Wars as much as Star Wars fans.
No one hates the ending of Game of Thrones as much as Game of Thrones fans.
Oh my God, I refuse to watch the ending of season 8 of Game of Thrones.
I refuse to watch that whole show because you just end up getting like blue balled now. So anyways.
But these aren't truly bad games. Feyerbrand and I may not like certain Final Fantasy titles as much as you, or as much as each other even, or whatever the case is. We are sharing our experiences with them, but ideally, we are going to dive into why. We are going to evaluate our opinions. And if you think that we're wrong, share your opinions with us. Feel free to try and convince us otherwise, because we want this to be a discourse and an exchange. We don't want to just be cynical jerks that hate certain Final Fantasies. There's so many Final Fantasies I haven't touched.
Yeah, we don't want to be those guys that are standing on a soapbox, making anybody feel bad for their opinion. So we are very much open to any sort of conversation pertaining to Final Fantasy, even if it's your opinion's different than ours. Convince me. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I misunderstood something. Maybe I played the game at the wrong point in my life and I wasn't in the right headspace to understand the message they were trying to get across. I don't know.
Yeah, you listener are not wrong for liking a different Final Fantasy or feeling completely different with us. Kudos to you.
Unless it's 2.
Unless it's 2. That's just going to be a running joke at this point. Each Final Fantasy is so wildly different that, like, everyone, not just us, but each listener, each person that Final Fantasy touches, they're all going to have different favorites. So, relish, cherish that, cheer on your fellow fans for loving something else. That's the great thing about Final Fantasy. They get to touch so many different topics and messages and themes within these games and do different characters and all of that. It's great. Finishing up, though, the last thing I want to pitch your way, Feyerbrand. Final Fantasy is a game series franchise.
Yes, it is a game series
that relies very heavily on the idea of jobs, and it's not the only game franchise, whatever, that deals with jobs, but it's pretty Final Fantasy, the idea of jobs. If you were going to be in a Final Fantasy game, what job would you be?
I hate this question.
I know. You're already rubbing your temple, and I know it was going to do this to you.
I hate this question because I don't have a why. I don't know why my brain works the way it works.
ADHD.
I am not diagnosed with that. I have an appointment. It's possible, but I'm not saying I have it. I don't know why my brain works the way it does, but I am incapable of choosing one job, because no matter how much I'm in love with a job, the very next day, I could think it's the dumbest thing in the world, and the next job is the greatest one ever. And really, the only one that's kind of continued to keep my attention, even at a very small level, has been Dragoon. And that's just because of like the armor and like the idea of, jumping into the heavens to come down and pierce dragons. And like, that's just super, super cool. That's the only one that's ever kept my attention, even for a little bit, even when I'm like, okay, I don't want to be this or play this anymore. It's always been Dragoon, but I don't, like, if I was to envision myself in a Final Fantasy game, I cannot envision me as anything. I'm a flan then. I don't know. I'm literally just jello. I'm nothing. I don't know. I don't have an answer to this question.
Which is funny because my answer, there is only one answer, and it's only ever been one answer. If I were a job, I would be a summoner. Hands down. That's it. 14 and 11, I main summoners. I've leveled other things, but it's always summoner.
Not even a question?
Not even a question.
No question about it.
Summons are probably the coolest thing. It's the thing I look forward to in every Final Fantasy. If they don't nail the summons or do something cool with summons, I'm already like, all right, I guess. But summons are the coolest thing.
Makes you wonder why 6 didn't hit for you. Because there was a pretty big plot device involving summons.
Yeah, the Espers were cool, like I said, and Terra is super cool. But like, honestly, I think the hardest thing about 6 is the graphics and the aesthetic. And I didn't have it when I was younger, and they just need to remake 6 with modern day graphics, and I'll probably love it. I don't know. It's probably that simple.
I'm down. Let's do it, Square Enix.
But
so you're a summoner. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a freelancer. I'm an Onion Knight.
I'm just going to change it up, wherever the wind takes me.
I'm an ex-soldier.
I don't know. Just give me a big headband with a summoner horn on it, and I'm set. Bigger the horn, the better.
I don't give me something to help me decide. I don't know.
But there's also nothing wrong with that. As funny and as many jokes as we crack about it, your constant job switching with 14 is an endearing quality. Like every time you reach out and you're like, okay, I think this is my main and I'm going to tell you why. And like my first thought is like, this is going to last 2 weeks. And I know this, but I love this man. I'm going to support him. Feyerbrand, tell me why this is your main. What do you love about it? What did you like about this over your other job? And let's just talk about it. There will be a lot of that.
And that's what I do. I dive deep into the mechanics and I min-max it and I have plans and ideas. And then usually before I even hit max level with it, I've already switched to something else. So I have a lot of jobs halfway leveled.
We have indulged you for many, 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 many years at this point, and I will continue to indulge you for many, many years because Final Fantasy is great and you're my best friend and I love it. So
I don't know. Who knows? Maybe they'll come out with something cool for the new melee job in 14 instead of something lame like the Sage.
I mean, I didn't realize it was going to be Sage, but when I saw those like crazy Gundam-like wings like launch off with lasers, I was like, this is tight. And then they were like, it's a healer. And I was like, never mind.
Honestly, if it just wasn't called Sage, I'd probably support it more, but it just, in my mind, that doesn't scream Sage, and that might be because of, like, Tactics Advance and stuff like that, and, like, the Ivalice world, but I didn't like it was called Sage, man. I don't know, call it, like, Mecha Healer 5000. I'd probably been like, yo, this is dope, I'm down, I'm rolling it, but I don't know, not Sage. Sage makes me think of, like, some 100-year-old dude who, like, Tella, who knows every single magic ever.
Yeah, there is a certain, like, aesthetic and visual component that goes in when you say Sage, and it's not crazy Gundam potion wings like injectors that like launch out. But no matter what, like, it was a healer. I was never going to play it. I am a DPS through and through for everything,
Yes, you are. And I can always count on you to jump in my usual tank queue.
Yes, you can.
Or healer queue, whatever I'm feeling that day.
Whatever you're feeling.
I'm a DPS too, and we're both going to wait 40 minutes. I don't know.
I'll wait that 40 minutes with you.
We'll do it.
You're no stranger to that queue.
No, God, no. Oh my God, I've been in so many DPS queues.
All right. So that all being said, one of the last notes before we kind of sign off in here is, as far as the future of this podcast goes, we do plan on it being a bi-weekly podcast. That being said, depending on what type of news drops, any like juicy trailers or any great thing that we think like, oh my God, we want to react to this without waiting for 2 weeks, we might record like a random one-off episode that is only 10 minutes where you just get to hear us lose our minds over something cool. We are not, what's the word? We did not go to school for video games and to write articles on them. So we will not be providing you reviews. However, we will provide you with our personal take and opinions about games as they come out. Intergrade is coming on June 10th. So once we play that,
oh yeah,
we will talk a fair bit about that. But please do not ever think of us as a source of news. We will talk about our opinions on the news, but we are not trained or learned reviewers or critics. Just take our opinions for what they are. Just two random dudes who love Final Fantasy.
We're just two dudes. That's it.
Yeah, we're just two dudes, two white dudes who love Final Fantasy. So please factor that in when you listen to us. But a lot of our content, not all, because we're certainly going to dive into each Final Fantasy at length. We're going to revisit old Final Fantasies. We really want to kind of hunker down and talk about these. But a fair amount of our coverage for the foreseeable future is really going to revolve around Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy 16, and Final Fantasy 14. And that's one, we love those games and hope we love Final Fantasy 16. But two, that's where we're at within the cycle of these games releasing. We've got Intergrade coming June 10th. They're working hard on part 2 of the remake whenever that's going to release. The First Soldier, which is like a battle royale PUBG Final Fantasy thing for mobile. I won't play it. Honestly, I'm just not a big mobile game person, or let alone a battle royale. But that comes out later this year. Ever Crisis, which is like the remake a lot of people wanted within Final Fantasy VII, but they're also readdressing the continuity of all the old games. That comes out next year. That's going to be fantastic.
And it's free to play.
Yes.
Like, you don't even have to buy the game.
There will be a gacha mechanic, which I think they said is like for weapons and stuff like that. But
yeah, it's all weapons, which I'm just going to buy them all.
The monthly updates for chapters and stuff, that's completely free. 16, there's been a lot of speculation and rumors and news that got posted, then was taken down, that 16 is supposed to release this year. I'm not sure. I could see 16 releasing like in this fiscal year, which for Japan means it could release anytime between now and April of 2022. But I personally think we'll see 16 next year, but we're expecting news very soon over that, probably over the summer with a lot of the big gaming conferences and stuff. We'll be getting an update very soon.
They already said they're not going to be at E3, so I'm just going to assume they're going to do their own little thing again.
That's what I'm thinking too, but I still picture that being in the summer personally, just like after
E3.
E3.
No, I agree. I'm pretty sure last time it was like within a couple weeks or a month. But also, if you think about it, Square Enix has Intergrade and the PS5 update and all that for the 7 remake coming in June. And then they're probably going to do some big announcements after that. And then in the fall of this year, we have, Endwalker or whatever it's called, the new 14 expansion.
Yep.
And that's probably going to take us into early next year, which is my guess when we'll see 16. And then we'll see part 2 probably after that in like the summer. And that's completely based on nothing other than my instinct. So don't go spreading that.
My instinct is 2023. I think Feyerbrand is far more optimistic than me, but we'll see. We'll see. I would love the game to be out sooner.
I have faith. I have faith in that creative development team, 5000. So I believe in them. Look what they did with 14.
Oh, I'm talking 7 part 2. I thought you were saying that was going to be summer.
I was talking 16.
No, 16 is for sure next year, like 100%.
Don't you put that evil on me with part 2. No, it's 2022. If it's not, I'll cry myself to sleep or something. I'll stream myself crying. Okay.
I'm calling it now 2023. I'm sorry, but we'll see.
We'll see.
But
hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
Exactly. So we'll be talking a lot about those games, but with a bi-weekly podcast, there's plenty of time for us to talk about and dive into other Final Fantasies and revisit them. We got a lot of time. There's going to be big windows between game releases that we're going to have to fill with something. So that'll be
like you playing Final Fantasy 12.
Yes.
In Tactics.
Yes, I think Final Fantasy 12, after I beat 9 and 15, I think 12 is going to be on my docket, because 12, I actually own the physical copy of the game because I have yours. And it is...
That's what happened to it.
Yeah.
I was wondering what happened to it.
You mailed it to me. I have it. It's sitting right here.
That's right. And my Kingdom Hearts.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So I will be revisiting 12. And... yeah, that'll be probably my next one. So is there anything you want to add, Feyerbrand, before we kind of close this train wreck out,
I just want to say, if you're still here with us at the end, thank you all for joining us. We hope that you continue to listen to us, and we appreciate every single one of you.
Yes, thank you all for sticking with us this long. I promise we will still be this prone to go on tangents in every single episode. That's not going to change. I'm not even going to lie to you.
Maybe we both have ADHD. I don't know.
But we're just going to lean right into it. Well, there'll be many things like, what were we talking about? All right, back on point. But thank you for sticking around with us and joining us. Please rate, review, share this podcast. We have every expectation we're going to start out pretty slow without many listeners, but would love to grow. So please spread the word. We are on Twitter at Magus Brothers. Follow us there for discussions. Give us your opinions. Tell us we're awful. Tell us we're awful for our opinions on Final Fantasy, or tell us what resonated with you. Create a dialogue, a discussion. We'll be sharing a Discord after we kind of get some traction here. But yeah, thank you for sticking around. And again, please look at the details and description of this podcast for the people who have helped us get here and Chocobo Band. So we appreciate you.
Whenever I sang my songs on the stage on my own, whenever I said my words, wishing that would be heard, I saw you smiling at me. Was it real or just my fantasy? You'd always be there in the corner of this time.